The terminal gates at Denver International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of evening departures when Captain Blake Morrison stepped directly in front of Special Agent Zara Coleman, blocking her path to the jet bridge. His weathered face twisted into a sneer as he looked her up and down, taking in her professional attire and confident demeanor with obvious disdain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I don't think so, he said flatly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. This flight is for paying passengers only. Zara stood perfectly still, her expression calm despite the familiar sting of assumption and prejudice. In her leather portfolio was everything she needed to prove her credentials. But she had learned long ago that revealing her true identity too quickly sometimes meant missing the opportunity to see exactly who people really were when they thought no one important was watching. "I have a confirmed seat on this aircraft," she replied evenly, her voice steady and professional. Morrison crossed his arms, his pilot's uniform giving him an air of unquestioned authority that he clearly relished wielding. "Let me guess. Some kind of charity case or diversity program ticket? Well, not on my plane." What Captain Morrison didn't know was that Special Agent Zara Coleman had spent the last 18 months tracking a sophisticated human trafficking ring that moved victims through major airports using compromised airline personnel. Her investigation had led her to this exact flight, this exact airline, and this exact moment that would change everything for both of them. 3 days earlier, Zara had been reviewing surveillance footage in the FBI's Denver field office when she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A young woman, barely 18, had been escorted through security by someone claiming to be her uncle. The girl's body language screamed distress, her eyes darting around desperately as if searching for help that never came. By the time Zara had traced the connection, the girl had disappeared into a network that her team had been hunting for over a year. Zara Coleman had not intended to become the FBI's leading expert on human trafficking. At 34, she had originally joined the Bureau with dreams of working white-collar crime, following money trails and unraveling complex financial schemes. But after her first case involving missing children, she found herself drawn deeper into the dark world of modern slavery, becoming one of the youngest supervisory special agents in the Human Trafficking Task Force. Growing up as the daughter of a single mother in Chicago's South Side, Zara had learned early that the world often judged people by their appearance before giving them a chance to prove their worth. Her mother, Dr. Angela Coleman, had been an emergency room physician who worked double shifts to put Zara through school, constantly reminding her daughter that excellence was not optional when you look like they did. "Baby girl," her mother would say during those late-night study sessions, "you're going to have to be twice as good to get half the recognition, but that doesn't mean you accept half the respect." Those words had carried Zara through her undergraduate degree at Northwestern, her law degree from Georgetown, and through the rigorous training at Quantico that had pushed her to her physical and mental limits. Even now, standing in the Denver airport facing down a pilot who had already decided she didn't belong, she could hear her mother's voice reminding her to stay focused on the bigger picture. The investigation that had brought her to this moment had consumed the better part of 2 years. The trafficking ring operated with military precision, using legitimate businesses as fronts and corrupting employees at every level of the transportation industry. Airport security guards looked the other way, airline personnel provided cover stories, and even some law enforcement officers had been compromised. But Zara's team had finally identified a pattern. Every few weeks, groups of young women would board flights to cities known for their underground markets. The women traveled with handlers who posed as family members or employers, carrying documentation that appeared legitimate but fell apart under close scrutiny. The operation was sophisticated enough to avoid most detection, but not careful enough to avoid the attention of someone with Zara's particular expertise. Her phone had buzzed that morning with a message from her partner, Agent Marcus Torres, confirming their worst fears. Another group was scheduled to move today, and this time they had identified the specific flight. What they hadn't expected was for Zara to encounter resistance before she could even board the aircraft. Standing in the airport now, facing Captain Morrison's obvious hostility, Zara recognized something familiar in his demeanor. It wasn't just standard prejudice. There was something calculated about his refusal, something that spoke to a deeper involvement in the very network she had been hunting. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that this confrontation was about more than just a bigoted pilot having a bad day. Morrison's reaction was too immediate, too forceful, and too specific. He hadn't even looked at her boarding pass or asked for identification. He had simply seen her and decided she didn't belong. The other passengers waiting to board had begun to notice the confrontation. Some watched with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing something they knew was wrong but weren't sure how to address. Others seemed annoyed by the delay, checking their watches and shifting impatiently. A few appeared genuinely concerned, their expressions suggesting they recognized the discrimination playing out before them. Zara made a mental note of each face, her trained eye automatically cataloging potential witnesses and assessing their likelihood to speak up if the situation escalated. Years of undercover work had taught her to read people quickly and accurately, skills that were serving her well in this unexpected confrontation. Behind Morrison, she could see the gate agents watching nervously. One of them, a young Latina woman whose name tag read Sophia, looked particularly distressed by her captain's behavior. Sophia stepped forward hesitantly, clearly wanting to intervene, but uncertain how to challenge a senior pilot's authority. "Captain Morrison," Sophia said carefully, "perhaps we should check the passenger manifest and verify." "I don't need to verify anything," Morrison cut her off sharply. "I can spot trouble when I see it, and I'm not having any disruptions on my flight." The assumption underlying his words was clear to everyone within earshot. In Morrison's mind, Zara's very presence constituted a potential disruption, not because of anything she had done or said, but simply because of who she was and what she represented to his particular worldview. What Morrison couldn't have known was that his refusal to allow her to board was about to intersect with an active federal investigation in ways that would expose not just his own prejudices, but an entire network of corruption that had been operating under the protection of exactly the kind of institutional authority he was now wielding against her. As the confrontation continued to unfold in the busy terminal, with dozens of witnesses pulling out phones to record the interaction, neither Zara nor Morrison could have anticipated how this moment would reshape not only their individual lives, but the entire investigation that had brought them together in this place and time. The next few minutes would prove that sometimes the most significant breakthroughs in complex cases come not from months of careful planning, but from the unexpected moments when prejudice and justice collide in the most public of spaces. Denver International Airport's Terminal C operated like a well-oiled machine on most evenings, with thousands of passengers flowing through its gates toward destinations across the country. The terminal's soaring architecture and massive windows created an atmosphere of constant motion, where business travelers rushed between connections and families gathered their belongings for vacation departures. Gate 47, where Pacific Northwest Airlines Flight 891 to Seattle was preparing for its 8:30 p.m. departure, had become the epicenter of an increasingly tense situation. Pacific Northwest Airlines prided itself on efficiency and customer service, at least according to the corporate messaging displayed throughout the terminal. Their blue and silver livery promised excellence in every journey, while promotional videos played on monitors showcasing diverse, smiling passengers being attended to by professional, courteous staff. The reality, as Zara was discovering, sometimes diverged significantly from the marketing materials. Captain Blake Morrison had spent 26 years building his reputation within the airline industry, rising through the ranks from regional carrier co-pilot to senior captain on transcontinental routes. His personnel file, which Zara's investigation would later reveal, contained numerous commendations for his technical flying skills and safety record. What it didn't contain were the complaints that had been quietly buried or dismissed over the years, incidents where Morrison's treatment of passengers and crew members had crossed professional boundaries. Morrison commanded respect through a combination of genuine aviation expertise and carefully cultivated intimidation. Flight attendants knew better than to question his decisions, gate agents deferred to his authority without hesitation, and airport personnel generally gave him a wide berth when he was in one of his moods. This evening, as he stood blocking Zara's path to the aircraft, he was very much in one of those moods. The gate area had filled with the usual mix of travelers waiting for the Seattle departure. Business executives typed furiously on laptops, trying to squeeze in last-minute work before takeoff. A family with 3 young children struggled to keep their luggage organized, while the parents took turns chasing after their energetic toddler. An elderly couple sat quietly, holding hands and watching the activity around them with the patient observation of people who had seen it all before. Among the waiting passengers, Dr. Harrison Webb sat apart from the others, his expensive suit and Platinum Airlines status marking him as someone accustomed to preferential treatment. Webb's leather briefcase contained documentation for what appeared to be a legitimate consulting business, but his nervous glances toward the gate and the way he kept checking his phone suggested his travel plans involved more than routine business meetings. Nearby, Maria Santos clutched a worn envelope containing what she believed were work authorization papers for a housekeeping position in Seattle. At 19, she had been promised opportunities that seemed too good to be true, and the man who had arranged her travel had been very specific about which flight she needed to take and which gate agent would help her if there were any problems. The fact that Dr. Webb had been watching her since she arrived at the gate was not a coincidence. The gate agents working Flight 891 had learned to navigate the complex dynamics of their workplace with careful attention to unspoken hierarchies. Sofia Martinez, the lead gate agent, had been with Pacific Northwest Airlines for 8 years, long enough to understand which battles were worth fighting and which were better avoided. Her supervisor, Regional Manager David Chen, was known for supporting his employees when corporate policies were clear, but became notably absent when situations required challenging senior personnel like Captain Morrison. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind the scenes, the airline's operations ran on a network of relationships and informal agreements that sometimes superseded official procedures. Maintenance supervisors who wanted their reports processed quickly learned to stay on Morrison's good side. Catering staff knew that certain special requests from specific crew members were to be honored without question. Even some TSA personnel had developed working relationships with airline staff that occasionally bent standard security protocols in the name of operational efficiency. This ecosystem of mutual accommodation had created perfect conditions for the trafficking network that Zara's team had been investigating. When trusted airline personnel vouched for passengers, security screenings became less thorough. When captains personally ensured that certain travelers were taken care of, questions that might otherwise arise were smoothed away. When gate agents were told that specific passengers required special handling, the system adapted to provide exactly that. The network operated through a sophisticated system of coded communications and carefully cultivated relationships. Dr. Webb, despite his legitimate medical credentials, served as a high-level coordinator, using his professional status to provide credibility for the operation. He identified vulnerable young women through various channels, arranged their documentation, and coordinated their transportation to destinations where they would disappear into forced labor situations. Morrison's role in the network was crucial but carefully limited. He didn't directly recruit victims or handle the financial transactions that kept the operation running. Instead, he provided something equally valuable: the authority to override normal procedures when necessary. If questions arose about passengers or their documentation, Morrison's word as captain was generally accepted without further scrutiny. If seat assignments needed to be changed to keep victims isolated from potential helpers, Morrison could authorize those changes with a simple phone call. The beauty of the system, from the trafficker's perspective, was its reliance on legitimate authority structures. Most airline employees were honest people doing their jobs, but they were also trained to respect hierarchy and avoid questioning senior personnel. When Captain Morrison expressed concerns about specific passengers, his subordinates assumed he was exercising appropriate professional judgment rather than protecting a criminal enterprise. This evening's flight to Seattle was carrying what the network considered a particularly valuable cargo. In addition to Maria Santos, 2 other young women were scheduled to board, each carrying documentation provided by Dr. Webb's organization. Their handlers had paid premium prices for the extra security that Morrison's involvement provided, and they expected their investment to yield smooth, uninterrupted transportation to their destination. What none of them had anticipated was the presence of Special Agent Zara Coleman, whose investigation had identified this specific flight as a critical link in their transportation chain. Her team had traced financial records, analyzed travel patterns, and conducted surveillance operations that had gradually revealed the scope and sophistication of the network they were pursuing. The confrontation now unfolding at Gate 47 was not simply about one pilot's prejudices or one passenger's rights. It was the collision of two different systems, one designed to exploit vulnerability and authority, and another dedicated to exposing and dismantling that exploitation. The dozens of passengers and staff members watching the interaction had no way of knowing that they were witnessing the beginning of an operation that would ultimately expose corruption reaching far beyond a single flight or a single airline. As tension continued to build around the gate, with Morrison refusing to budge and Zara maintaining her calm professionalism, the various players in this complex drama remained unaware of how their individual actions would soon intersect with consequences none of them could have imagined. The standoff at Gate 47 attracted increasingly uncomfortable attention as passengers began pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. Captain Morrison seemed to relish the audience, his voice growing louder as he addressed not just Zara, but everyone within earshot. "This is exactly what's wrong with air travel today," Morrison announced, gesturing dismissively toward Zara. "People think they can just show up and demand special treatment. Well, I run a safe, professional operation, and I don't have time for troublemakers." Dr. Harrison Webb, who had been watching from his premium seating area, stood abruptly and approached the gate counter. His movement was calculated, designed to appear supportive of Morrison while positioning himself to observe Zara more closely. Something about her composure and professional demeanor had triggered alarm bells in his experienced assessment of potential threats to their operation. "Captain Morrison is absolutely right," Webb interjected with the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "Security protocols exist for good reason. If this passenger can't follow basic boarding procedures, perhaps she should consider alternative transportation." Zara's trained eye immediately cataloged Webb's intervention as suspicious. His eagerness to support Morrison's position, combined with his expensive attire and obvious air of authority, suggested someone with more than a casual interest in the outcome of this confrontation. She made a mental note to have her team run his identification through their databases. Sofia Martinez found herself caught in an increasingly impossible situation. Her training emphasized customer service and conflict de-escalation, but she had also learned that challenging Captain Morrison's decisions typically resulted in negative performance reviews and reduced scheduling opportunities. She approached the group hesitantly, carrying the passenger manifest and trying to find a middle ground. "Perhaps we could review the boarding documentation," Sophia suggested diplomatically. "I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly and get everyone on board." Morrison rounded on her with barely contained irritation. "Martinez, I thought I made myself clear. This passenger doesn't belong on my aircraft, and I don't need to justify my decisions to gate agents. Your job is to follow my instructions, not question them." The public nature of Morrison's rebuke visibly humiliated Sophia, who had been trying to help resolve the situation professionally. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the inappropriate nature of Morrison's treatment of his own colleague. The incident was being captured by multiple phone cameras, adding another layer of witnesses to Morrison's escalating behavior. Meanwhile, Maria Santos watched the confrontation with growing anxiety. The man who had arranged her travel had been very specific about staying quiet and avoiding attention during her journey. But the scene unfolding at the gate was drawing exactly the kind of scrutiny she had been warned to avoid. She clutched her envelope of documents more tightly, uncertain whether she should try to leave or continue waiting for boarding to begin. A middle-aged businessman named Robert Chen, no relation to the regional manager, approached the gate desk with his platinum status card visible, clearly expecting priority treatment. He had observed enough of the confrontation to form strong opinions about what was happening. "Excuse me," he addressed Morrison directly, "but as a million-mile passenger with this airline, I'm concerned about the delays and the unprofessional nature of this interaction. Perhaps we should focus on getting the flight boarded on schedule." Morrison's response revealed the full extent of his arrogance and sense of untouchable authority. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your loyalty to Pacific Northwest Airlines, but I don't take operational advice from passengers, regardless of their status level. I suggest you return to your seat and allow me to handle security matters." The dismissal of a high-status passenger shocked even Dr. Webb, who recognized that Morrison's behavior was becoming dangerously erratic. The captain's willingness to antagonize someone with obvious influence within the airline suggested that his hatred was overriding his usual careful preservation of plausible deniability. Zara remained silent during these exchanges, allowing Morrison to reveal more about himself with each interaction. Her years of investigative training had taught her that suspects often provided the most valuable intelligence when they felt confident and unchallenged. Morrison's treatment of Sophia, his dismissal of a platinum passenger, and his obvious comfort with public confrontation were all data points that would prove useful in the larger investigation. A gate agent from an adjacent departure walked over to assess the situation, having noticed the growing crowd and the obvious tension. Jennifer Walsh had worked the Denver hub for 12 years and had never seen Captain Morrison behave so openly confrontational with passengers. "Sophia, is everything okay here?" Jennifer asked, offering potential backup to her colleague. Morrison immediately stepped forward to block this new intervention. "This doesn't concern you, Walsh. Return to your own gate and mind your own business." But Jennifer had recognized Zara from her previous travels through Denver, though she couldn't quite place where she had seen her before. There was something familiar about the woman's calm professional bearing that suggested she was more than just another passenger caught up in an unfortunate confrontation. "Ma'am," Jennifer addressed Zara directly, "I apologize for any inconvenience. If you'd like to speak with a supervisor about rebooking options, I'd be happy to help coordinate that." The offer of alternative assistance seemed to enrage Morrison further. "No one is rebooking anything. I've made my decision about this passenger, and that decision is final. Any agent who undermines my authority will be reported to management for disciplinary action." The threat was clear and immediate. Morrison was using his position not just to discriminate against Zara, but to intimidate any employee who might consider helping her. The abuse of authority extended beyond prejudice into active suppression of colleagues who attempted to follow proper customer service protocols. Dr. Webb sensed that the situation was spiraling beyond Morrison's control and decided to take a more direct approach. He approached Zara with what appeared to be concern, but was actually reconnaissance. "Miss, I'm a physician and I can see this situation is causing you distress. Perhaps I could help mediate this misunderstanding. Sometimes these airline procedures can be confusing, and I'm sure Captain Morrison would be willing to explain the specific security concerns that are preventing your travel." The attempt to position himself as a helpful intermediary, while simultaneously validating Morrison's discriminatory behavior, revealed Webb's sophisticated understanding of manipulation tactics. He was simultaneously gathering information about Zara while providing Morrison with a face-saving narrative that framed the confrontation as a reasonable security measure rather than obvious prejudice. Zara's response was measured and revealing. "I appreciate your concern, doctor, but I'm quite familiar with airline procedures and security protocols. I'm also comfortable waiting for this situation to be resolved through appropriate channels." Her calm confidence and specific mention of security protocols seemed to unnerve both Morrison and Webb. There was something in her tone that suggested she knew far more about their respective situations than a typical passenger should. The dynamic was beginning to shift as Morrison's assumed superiority met Zara's unshakable composure. The gate area had been filled with passengers from other flights who had been drawn by the commotion, creating an audience of dozens of witnesses to Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior. Social media posts were already beginning to surface, with hashtags identifying the airline and flight number. The situation was rapidly evolving from a private discrimination incident into a very public relations crisis. As boarding time approached with no resolution in sight, the pressure on all parties was about to reach a breaking point that would force the true nature of everyone's motivations into the open. The boarding announcement for Flight 891 crackled over the gate's intercom system, but instead of the usual orderly queue forming, passengers remained clustered around the confrontation, unwilling to miss what had clearly become an extraordinary situation. Captain Morrison's face had grown increasingly flushed, as his authority was questioned by multiple parties, and his next decision would prove to be his most catastrophic. "Security to Gate 47, Morrison announced loudly into his radio, making sure every passenger could hear. "I need immediate assistance with an unruly passenger who is disrupting flight operations and potentially poses a security threat." The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the gate area. Passengers who had been recording the interaction exchanged alarmed glances. Recognizing that Morrison had just escalated the situation to an entirely different level, Zara remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. But her mind was rapidly calculating the implications of Morrison's decision to involve airport security based on fabricated charges. Dr. Webb stepped closer to Morrison, lowering his voice but remaining audible to nearby passengers. "Captain, are you certain this is the appropriate level of response? Perhaps we could resolve this more quietly." For the first time since the confrontation began, Webb seemed genuinely concerned about the attention being drawn to their operation. The arrival of security personnel would mean official reports, potential background checks, and exactly the kind of scrutiny their trafficking network had spent years learning to avoid. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Morrison snapped, his confidence unshaken by Webb's subtle warning. "I've dealt with troublemakers before, and I won't have my authority undermined in front of passengers and crew." Sofia Martinez made one final attempt to de-escalate the situation before security arrived. "Captain Morrison, with respect, this passenger has been completely cooperative. She hasn't raised her voice, made any threats, or violated any airline policies. Perhaps we could simply—" "Martinez!" Morrison's voice cut across the gate area like a whip. "I've had enough of your interference. Consider yourself written up for insubordination. Return to your station immediately, and do not speak to this passenger again." The public humiliation of Sofia galvanized several passengers who had been reluctant to get involved. Robert Chen stepped forward again, his platinum status card prominently displayed. "Captain, I'm going to be filing a formal complaint with Pacific Northwest Airlines about your treatment of both passengers and staff. This behavior is completely unacceptable, and I'll be sure to mention it to my contacts in your corporate office." Morrison's response revealed the full extent of his detachment from reality. "Mr. Chen, feel free to file whatever complaints you want. I have 30 years of unblemished service with this airline, and my judgment regarding security matters has never been questioned. Your complaints will go nowhere." What Morrison didn't realize was that his, quote, unblemished record existed only because previous complaints had been systematically buried through the very network he was now trying to protect. His confidence in his untouchable status was about to collide with a reality he had never been forced to confront. The airport security team that responded to Morrison's call consisted of 3 officers: Sergeant Patricia Williams, a 15-year veteran who had seen every kind of airport drama imaginable; Officer Kevin Rodriguez, a former military police officer who approached situations with careful analysis; and Officer Sarah Kim, relatively new to airport security but trained to recognize when situations didn't match their reported descriptions. As the security team approached Gate 47, Sergeant Williams immediately noticed the crowd of passengers recording the interaction with their phones. In her experience, actual security threats rarely attracted this kind of organized documentation from bystanders. Something about the scene suggested they were walking into a situation that was not what it appeared to be. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sergeant Williams asked, addressing Morrison directly while keeping her eyes on the larger group. Morrison straightened his uniform and adopted his most authoritative tone. "Sergeant, this passenger has been disrupting our boarding process, refusing to follow crew instructions, and creating a disturbance that's preventing us from maintaining our departure schedule. I need her removed from the gate area immediately." Dr. Webb positioned himself where he could observe Zara's reaction to the security presence, still trying to assess whether she posed a threat to their operation. Her continued calm in the face of Morrison's escalating accusations was beginning to worry him seriously. Officer Rodriguez addressed Zara directly. "Ma'am, can you tell us your version of what's happened here?" Before Zara could respond, Morrison interrupted aggressively. "Officer, I don't think that's necessary. As captain of this aircraft, I have final authority over passenger safety, and I've determined this individual cannot be permitted to board. That should be sufficient for your purposes." Sergeant Williams had encountered enough abuse of authority during her career to recognize it when she saw it. Morrison's attempt to bypass normal procedures and his obvious expectation that his word alone should be sufficient raised immediate red flags. "Captain, we appreciate your concerns, but our protocol requires us to speak with all parties involved. Ma'am, please go ahead." Zara spoke for the first time since security arrived, her voice carrying a calm authority that immediately shifted the dynamic of the entire interaction. "Officers, I arrived at this gate with a confirmed reservation and valid identification for Flight 891 to Seattle. Captain Morrison blocked my access to the boarding process based solely on his visual assessment of my appearance. I have not violated any airline policies, federal regulations, or airport security procedures. I have not raised my voice, made threats, or engaged in any disruptive behavior." Her precise professional language and obvious familiarity with proper procedures caught the attention of all 3 security officers. Officer Kim stepped closer, her training telling her that something significant was about to be revealed. "Ma'am, could we see your identification and boarding documents?" Officer Kim requested politely. Morrison interjected immediately. "I've already determined that her documentation is suspicious. That's part of why I called for security assistance." "You haven't looked at any of my documentation," Zara replied calmly. "You've made assumptions based solely on my race and gender, as multiple witnesses can confirm." The accusation hung in the air like an electric charge. Dozens of passengers nodded in agreement, and several called out confirmations of Zara's account. The video recordings that had captured Morrison's behavior from multiple angles suddenly took on the weight of evidence, rather than simply social media content. Sergeant Williams recognized that they had moved far beyond a simple passenger dispute. "Ma'am, please show us your identification." Zara reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew not just a driver's license and boarding pass, but a second wallet that made all three security officers straighten immediately. She opened it to reveal a gold badge and federal identification card. "I'm Supervisory Special Agent Zara Coleman, Federal Bureau of Investigation Human Trafficking Task Force," she announced clearly, her voice carrying throughout the now silent gate area. "I'm traveling on official business as part of an active federal investigation into human trafficking operations that utilize commercial aviation." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Captain Morrison's face went from flushed red to ashen white in a matter of seconds. Dr. Webb took an involuntary step backward, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking as he realized the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. "Furthermore," Zara continued, looking directly at Morrison, "your refusal to allow a federal agent to board this aircraft, combined with your fabricated security claims and abuse of airline personnel, constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation. This entire flight is now part of an active crime scene." Sergeant Williams immediately understood the implications. "Agent Coleman, do you need us to secure the gate area?" "Yes, I do," Zara replied, pulling out her phone to contact her team. "No one boards or leaves this gate until my colleagues arrive. This operation is now under federal jurisdiction." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Morrison, who moments before had been wielding absolute authority, now stood speechless as the weight of his actions crashed down around him. Dr. Webb was frantically calculating escape routes while trying to maintain his cover as an innocent bystander. Maria Santos realized with growing terror that her promised opportunity had just become something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. In the space of a single revelation, the entire dynamic at Gate 47 had been reversed, and everyone present understood that they were no longer witnessing a simple case of airline discrimination, but the dramatic conclusion of a federal investigation that would reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the situation. Within minutes of Zara's revelation, Gate 47 transformed into a coordinated federal operation. Agent Marcus Torres arrived with a team of 6 FBI agents, moving swiftly through the terminal as passengers and staff were directed to remain in designated areas. The casual atmosphere of a typical airport gate had been replaced by the focused intensity of law enforcement professionals executing a carefully planned takedown. Dr. Harrison Webb made a calculated attempt to blend into the crowd of confused passengers, but his earlier interactions with Captain Morrison had already marked him as a person of interest. Agent Sarah Martinez, a specialist in financial crimes, approached him with the polite but unmistakable authority of someone who knew exactly who she was addressing. "Dr. Webb, I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI. We'd like to speak with you about your travel plans this evening," she said, positioning herself to block any potential escape route. Webb's years of operating within legitimate professional circles had not prepared him for direct confrontation with federal agents. His carefully rehearsed cover story began to crumble under the weight of specific questions about his relationship with Pacific Northwest Airlines, his frequent travel patterns, and his knowledge of other passengers on Flight 891. "I don't understand why you're questioning me," Webb protested, his voice carrying less conviction than he intended. "I'm simply a physician traveling to Seattle for a medical conference. I have no connection to whatever situation you're investigating." Agent Torres, meanwhile, was coordinating with airport security to ensure that all personnel associated with Flight 891 remained available for questioning. Captain Morrison stood frozen near the gate desk, his pilot's uniform no longer a symbol of authority but rather evidence of how far he had fallen from his position of trust. "Captain Morrison," Torres addressed him formally, "you're being detained for questioning in connection with obstruction of a federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to legal representation." The Miranda warnings echoed through the gate area, broadcast live on multiple social media streams as passengers continued recording the unprecedented scene. Morrison's legs seemed to give out slightly as he was guided to a chair, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his shock. Sofia Martinez found herself in the unexpected position of being a key witness rather than a subordinated employee. Agent Torres approached her with genuine respect, recognizing her earlier attempts to resolve the situation professionally despite Morrison's intimidation. "Ms. Martinez, we understand you tried to help de-escalate this situation. Can you tell us about any previous incidents involving Captain Morrison and passenger discrimination? Your observations could be crucial to our investigation." Sophia looked around the gate area, seeing her colleagues and passengers watching intently. For 8 years, she had swallowed her concerns about Morrison's behavior, accepting the airline's culture of protecting senior personnel. Now, with FBI agents requesting her testimony and witnesses documenting everything, she found the courage to speak truthfully. "This wasn't the first time," she began, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "Captain Morrison has a pattern of targeting passengers of color, especially women. We've been told that complaints against senior pilots rarely go anywhere, so most of us stopped reporting incidents." Her testimony opened a floodgate of corroborating accounts. Jennifer Walsh, the gate agent from the adjacent departure, approached Torres with her own observations about Morrison's behavior over the years. Robert Chen, the platinum status passenger, provided detailed accounts of Morrison's inappropriate responses to customer concerns. While passenger statements were being collected, specialized FBI units were conducting a more technical investigation. Agent Lisa Park, a cybercrimes expert, was accessing Morrison's electronic communications and financial records through emergency judicial orders. The evidence she uncovered painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond a single biased pilot. Morrison's bank accounts showed regular deposits from shell companies that his salary alone could not explain. His communication records revealed coded conversations with Dr. Webb and other members of the trafficking network. Most damaging were his airline system access logs, which showed him manipulating seat assignments in passenger manifests in ways that facilitated the movement of trafficking victims. Dr. Webb's attempted denials collapsed entirely when agents discovered his encrypted phone contained detailed coordination schedules for victim transportation. The device revealed not just his role in the current operation, but evidence of dozens of previous flights where young women had been moved through the network with Morrison's assistance. Maria Santos, who had been quietly terrified throughout the confrontation, finally understood the true nature of her situation when Agent Carmen Rodriguez, a specialist in victim services, approached her with gentle but direct questions about her travel arrangements. "Maria, we know this is frightening, but you're safe now," Agent Rodriguez explained in fluent Spanish. "The people who arranged your travel are part of a criminal organization that we've been investigating. You're not in trouble, but we need your help to understand how they operated." Maria's story revealed the sophisticated methods the network used to recruit victims. She had been promised legitimate employment, provided with convincing documentation, and coached on how to respond to potential questions from authorities. The operation had been so professional that she had genuinely believed she was participating in a legal immigration program. Her cooperation led to the identification of 2 other young women in the gate area who had been destined for the same fate. Ana Gutierrez and Elena Morales had traveled from different cities but carried similar documentation and had been given identical instructions about their Seattle contact arrangements. Regional Manager David Chen arrived at the gate, looking harried and increasingly panicked as he grasped the scope of the federal investigation unfolding within his terminal. His attempts to manage the public relations crisis were immediately redirected by Agent Torres, who informed him that Pacific Northwest Airlines was now under investigation for systematic violations of federal anti-trafficking laws. "Mr. Chen, we'll need complete access to your employment records, particularly any complaints filed against Captain Morrison over the past 5 years," Torres explained. "We'll also need documentation of your company's training procedures regarding passenger discrimination and human trafficking awareness." Chen's stammered responses revealed an institutional culture that had prioritized protecting senior employees over addressing legitimate concerns about their conduct. The airline's Human Resources Department had developed elaborate procedures for burying complaints rather than investigating them, creating the perfect environment for criminal enterprises to operate with impunity. Airport security cameras were being reviewed to identify other network associates who might have been present to observe the operation. Agent Kim Thompson, a behavioral analysis specialist, was working with airport personnel to trace the movement patterns of Dr. Webb and his associates over the past several months. The investigation revealed that this evening's flight was just one piece of a much larger operation. The network had been using Pacific Northwest Airlines' Seattle route as a primary corridor for moving victims to distribution points throughout the Pacific Northwest. Morrison's protection had made the route particularly attractive because his authority could override virtually any procedural questions that might arise. As evidence continued to accumulate, the scope of charges being prepared against Morrison and Webb expanded rapidly. What had begun as discrimination and obstruction of justice now included federal conspiracy charges, human trafficking, and violations of civil rights statutes. The potential sentences were climbing toward life imprisonment. Passengers who had initially been annoyed by flight delays were now posting social media content expressing amazement at witnessing the takedown of a human trafficking operation. The hashtags trending on various platforms had shifted from complaints about airline service to praise for Agent Coleman's professionalism and courage. Sophia Martinez received a call from Pacific Northwest Airlines corporate headquarters, informing her that she was being immediately promoted to gate supervisor pending a complete review of personnel practices at Denver International Airport. The airline's executives, facing potential criminal liability for their role in enabling the trafficking network, were moving quickly to demonstrate their commitment to reform. As the evening progressed and the investigation expanded, it became clear that the confrontation at Gate 47 had exposed not just individual criminal behavior, but an entire system of institutional protection that had allowed serious crimes to flourish under the cover of legitimate business operations. The ripple effects were just beginning. The investigation that began at Gate 47 rippled outward with unprecedented speed and scope, triggering the largest coordinated anti-trafficking operation in federal law enforcement history. Within 72 hours, FBI field offices in 12 major cities executed simultaneous raids that dismantled a criminal network spanning 3 countries and multiple industries. The evidence recovered from Dr. Webb's encrypted devices had provided a roadmap to an operation far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. Agent Zara Coleman found herself at the center of a media storm that transformed her from a relatively unknown federal investigator into the public face of anti-trafficking efforts. News outlets across the country featured her story, emphasizing how her professional composure in the face of blatant discrimination had led to one of the most significant trafficking prosecutions in recent memory. The narrative resonated with audiences who saw in her experience a reflection of their own encounters with institutional prejudice. Pacific Northwest Airlines faced an existential crisis that threatened its operational license and financial viability. Federal aviation authorities launched an emergency audit that uncovered systematic failures extending far beyond Captain Morrison's individual crimes. The company's internal communications, subpoenaed during the investigation, revealed executive-level awareness of discriminatory practices and a deliberate policy of protecting senior personnel from accountability. CEO Margaret Harrison found herself testifying before the House Transportation Committee within 2 weeks of the incident. Her appearance, broadcast live on multiple networks, became a defining moment in corporate accountability. Lawmakers pressed her for explanations of how such extensive criminal activity had flourished within a regulated industry that was supposed to prioritize passenger safety and security. Ms. Harrison, Committee Chairman Robert Martinez demanded during the hearing, "How do you explain your company's failure to act on 17 documented complaints against Captain Morrison over 5 years? Did corporate leadership believe that pilot seniority was more important than passenger safety?" Harrison's stammered responses revealed an organizational culture that had prioritized operational efficiency over ethical responsibility. The airline's board of directors, watching their stock price plummet in real time, moved swiftly to implement comprehensive reforms that went far beyond cosmetic changes. Chief Human Resources Officer Thomas Bradley, who had personally buried complaints against Morrison and dozens of other problematic employees, was terminated immediately, along with 2 regional managers who had participated in the cover-up system. The company established a completely new position, Director of Ethical Operations, reporting directly to the board and empowered to investigate discrimination complaints without interference from operational management. The financial implications extended beyond immediate personnel changes. Harrison announced the creation of a $50 million victim compensation fund, acknowledging the company's failure to protect vulnerable passengers. Insurance companies began reviewing coverage for discrimination-related claims, while investors filed class action lawsuits alleging that management had concealed material risks from shareholders. More significantly, Pacific Northwest Airlines became the first major carrier to implement mandatory human trafficking awareness training for all personnel, from gate agents to senior pilots. The program, developed in consultation with federal law enforcement and victim advocacy organizations, taught employees to recognize signs of trafficking and established direct reporting channels to authorities. The legal consequences for Morrison and Webb unfolded in federal court with unusual speed, as prosecutors sought to send a clear message about the severity of their crimes. Morrison's plea bargain negotiations collapsed when investigators revealed the full extent of his financial participation in the network. Bank records showed he had received over $300,000 in payments for facilitating victim transportation, far exceeding what could be explained as simple corruption. His defense attorney's attempts to portray him as a misguided employee who had made poor choices crumbled under the weight of evidence showing deliberate, systematic participation in human trafficking. Text messages recovered from his phone revealed celebrations of successful victim deliveries and frustration when law enforcement attention threatened operations. Dr. Webb faced even more severe consequences as prosecutors established his role as a network leader. His medical license was immediately suspended in all states where he held certification, while the American Medical Association launched a comprehensive review of physician involvement in human trafficking. The organization used Webb's case as a catalyst for new ethical guidelines and mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals. The Seattle operation that Maria Santos, Ana Gutierrez, and Elena Morales were destined for had been expecting 15 victims that week. When the women failed to arrive due to the Denver arrests, the network's Seattle coordinators panicked and attempted to flee. Their hasty escape triggered a dramatic chase through downtown Seattle that ended with 4 additional arrests and the rescue of 23 victims from various forced labor situations. The rescued victims' stories revealed the sophisticated methods the network used to maintain control. Many had been told their families would be harmed if they attempted to escape or contact authorities. Others had been convinced that they owed insurmountable debts for their transportation and documentation, making them fearful of seeking help even when opportunities arose. Immigration authorities, working closely with the FBI, ensured that rescued victims received appropriate protection rather than deportation. Maria Santos became a key witness in the prosecution, eventually receiving permanent residency status through the Federal Witness Protection Program. Her courage in testifying would prove crucial in dismantling similar networks operating through other transportation hubs. Regional airports across the country began reviewing their own security protocols after learning how the network had exploited gaps in passenger screening procedures. The Denver International Airport Authority implemented sweeping changes, establishing direct reporting channels between ground personnel and federal law enforcement. Airport workers received comprehensive training to recognize signs of human trafficking, while a new position, Federal Liaison Coordinator, was created to facilitate cooperation with ongoing investigations. Sofia Martinez's promotion to Gate Supervisor became a powerful symbol of organizational change within Pacific Northwest Airlines. Her willingness to speak truthfully about Morrison's behavior, despite years of institutional pressure to remain silent, inspired other employees to come forward with their own observations. The company received over 200 reports of discriminatory behavior from various personnel within the first month of establishing new reporting procedures. The ripple effects extended throughout the aviation industry as major airlines scrambled to avoid similar exposure. American Airlines terminated 3 senior pilots within weeks, citing newly discovered patterns of discriminatory behavior that had been previously overlooked. United Airlines established an anonymous reporting hotline specifically for discrimination complaints, while Delta Airlines implemented quarterly bias training for all customer-facing personnel. Federal Aviation Administration Director Sarah Chen announced new mandatory reporting requirements that forced airlines to disclose discrimination complaints and their resolution to federal authorities. Airlines that failed to properly investigate or address such complaints faced potential suspension of operating certificates, creating financial incentives for thorough reform. The case attracted international attention when European aviation authorities began questioning whether American airlines should maintain landing rights if they could not demonstrate adequate anti-trafficking protections. The pressure led to industry-wide adoption of new screening procedures and victim identification protocols that exceeded previous federal requirements. Robert Chen, the platinum passenger who had challenged Morrison's authority, found himself invited to join Pacific Northwest Airlines' newly formed Passenger Advocacy Board. His business influence, combined with his first-hand witness to the discrimination incident, provided credibility to the airline's reform efforts while ensuring that passenger perspectives were represented in policy development. 2 years after the confrontation at Gate 47, Special Agent Zara Coleman stood before a packed auditorium at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, addressing a graduating class of new federal agents. The case that had begun with a pilot's refusal to let her board a plane had fundamentally transformed how law enforcement approached the intersection of discrimination and organized crime. The morning sun streamed through the Academy's tall windows, illuminating faces that represented the most diverse class in FBI history, a change that many attributed directly to the inspiration drawn from Zara's story. The Coleman Protocol, as it had become known throughout federal law enforcement agencies, was now standard training for all agents working trafficking cases. The protocol emphasized how individual acts of prejudice often revealed larger criminal enterprises, teaching agents to recognize discrimination not just as a civil rights violation, but as a potential indicator of deeper criminal activity. The methodology had been adopted by Interpol, integrated into European Union law enforcement training, and translated into 37 languages for global distribution. Zara's promotion to Assistant Director of the Human Trafficking Task Force had made her one of the youngest people to achieve such rank in FBI history. Her corner office on the 5th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover Building overlooked Pennsylvania Avenue, providing a daily reminder of the democratic institutions she had sworn to protect. The walls displayed commendations from international law enforcement agencies, victim advocacy organizations, and congressional committees that had studied the case's implications. But the item she treasured most was a simple wooden frame containing a handwritten letter from Maria Santos, now a successful business owner in Phoenix, thanking her for seeing me as a person worth saving instead of a problem to be managed. The prosecution of Morrison and Dr. Webb had concluded with unprecedented sentences that sent shockwaves through criminal organizations worldwide. Morrison received 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, while Webb was sentenced to life imprisonment for his leadership role in the trafficking network. During sentencing, Judge Patricia Williams had delivered remarks that legal scholars would later cite as a landmark statement on institutional accountability. The defendants before this court did not merely commit individual crimes, Judge Williams had declared. They exploited systems of authority and trust to perpetrate systematic violations of human dignity. Captain Morrison used his position to shield criminal activity while simultaneously discriminating against the very agent investigating that activity. Dr. Webb corrupted his medical oath to facilitate the exploitation of vulnerable women. Their sentences must reflect not only their direct crimes, but their betrayal of the institutional trust that makes civilized society possible. The investigation had ultimately uncovered a network spanning 14 countries and involving over 2,000 victims across 6 years of operation. The financial scope was staggering. Prosecutors traced more than $47 million in illicit profits, most of which was recovered and distributed to victims through the federal restitution program. International cooperation had been unprecedented, with law enforcement agencies from Canada, Mexico, and 12 European nations providing crucial assistance in dismantling the network's global operations. But the true measure of change extended far beyond individual prosecutions and financial recovery. Maria Santos had become a powerful advocate for trafficking survivors, establishing the Santos Foundation to provide legal assistance and job training for rescued victims. The foundation's headquarters in Phoenix served over 300 survivors annually, offering everything from English language classes to business development loans. Her testimony before the United Nations Human Rights Council had influenced international protocols for victim protection and had been translated into 12 languages for global law enforcement training. When Agent Coleman looked at me in that airport, Maria told the UN Assembly, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words, she didn't see a problem to be solved or a case to be processed. She saw a human being whose life had value. That recognition gave me the strength to rebuild everything those criminals had tried to destroy. But more importantly, It taught me that I had an obligation to extend that same recognition to others who faced similar situations. Ana Gutierrez and Elena Morales had similarly transformed their experiences into advocacy work that created lasting change. Ana had completed her nursing degree with assistance from the Victim Compensation Fund and now worked at Phoenix General Hospital, where she had established the nation's first comprehensive medical trafficking identification program. Her protocols for recognizing abuse signs in emergency room patients had been adopted by over 200 hospitals nationwide and had led to the identification of dozens of additional trafficking victims. Elena had become a social worker specializing in immigrant services, using her bilingual skills and personal experience to help other victims navigate the complex legal system. She had testified before Congress about the psychological manipulation techniques used by trafficking organizations, providing insights that influenced new therapeutic approaches for trauma recovery. Her work with the Department of Health and Human Services had led to the creation of specialized counseling programs that address the unique needs of trafficking survivors. The institutional changes triggered by the case had rippled far beyond aviation into every sector of the transportation industry. The Department of Homeland Security had implemented comprehensive new training requirements for all personnel at ports of entry, teaching them to recognize the subtle signs of trafficking that Webb's network had exploited. Immigration and Customs Enforcement had revised their protocols to prioritize victim protection over deportation enforcement when trafficking was suspected, a policy change that had already resulted in the rescue of over 400 additional victims. Pacific Northwest Airlines had emerged from near bankruptcy to become an industry leader in ethical operations and corporate responsibility. CEO Margaret Harrison, who had survived initial shareholder attempts to remove her, had overseen a complete cultural transformation that attracted top talent and improved customer satisfaction ratings dramatically. The airline's stock price had not only recovered, but reached record highs as investors recognized the tangible value of genuine ethical leadership in an industry plagued by public relations crises. The company's Director of Ethical Operations, Dr. Jennifer Kim, had been recruited from academic criminology specifically for her expertise in organizational culture change. Under her leadership, Pacific Northwest had established the industry's most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program, which other airlines now licensed for their own operations. The program had been so successful that the Federal Aviation Administration was considering making similar training mandatory for all commercial carriers. Dr. Kim's annual reports to the Board of Directors showed remarkable improvements across all metrics. Employee satisfaction scores had increased by 40%, customer complaints related to service issues had dropped by 60%, and the airline had received recognition from multiple civil rights organizations for its commitment to equality. Perhaps most significantly, the company had not had a single discrimination complaint escalate to federal investigation since implementing the new procedures. Sofia Martinez had become a regional manager herself, overseeing gate operations across 3 airports and directly supervising over 200 employees. Her success story had been featured in industry publications as an example of how frontline employees could drive organizational change when given proper support and protection from retaliation. She regularly spoke at management conferences about the importance of empowering staff to report concerns without fear of career consequences. For years, I watched Captain Morrison intimidate passengers and colleagues, and I said nothing because I was afraid for my job, Sofia told a gathering of airline executives at the annual International Air Transport Association conference. Agent Coleman showed me that silence in the face of injustice isn't just morally wrong, it's practically dangerous for everyone involved. When we allow discrimination to flourish, we create environments where serious criminals can operate with impunity. Every employee who stays silent becomes an unwitting accomplice to much larger crimes. Robert Chen had leveraged his experience as a witness to the incident into a broader advocacy role that had transformed passenger rights across the industry. As chairman of the Passenger Rights Coalition, he had successfully lobbied for federal legislation requiring airlines to maintain public databases of discrimination complaints and their resolution. The Chen Transparency Act had been signed into law 18 months after the incident, creating unprecedented accountability for airline personnel practices and giving passengers access to information that had previously been hidden from public view. The legislation had already had a measurable impact, with airlines reporting significantly increased compliance with anti-discrimination policies now that their records were subject to public scrutiny. Consumer advocacy groups credited the transparency requirements with reducing discriminatory incidents by over 30% industry-wide within the first year of implementation. The academic community had extensively studied the case as a model for how individual resistance to discrimination could trigger systematic institutional change across multiple sectors. Dr. Amanda Foster at Georgetown University's Law Center had published a comprehensive analysis showing how Zara's decision to maintain professional composure while documenting Morrison's behavior had created a perfect storm of evidence that made institutional denial impossible. Agent Coleman's approach demonstrates the power of strategic patience over reactive confrontation, Dr. Foster explained in her widely cited paper, which had become required reading in law schools across the country. Rather than responding emotionally to provocation, she allowed Morrison to reveal the full extent of his bias while systematically gathering evidence that would expose the institutional nature of the problem. This methodology should be taught not just in law enforcement training, but in any context where individuals face systematic discrimination. Law schools across the country now use the case in civil rights courses, examining how individual acts of courage could create legal precedents that protected countless future victims. The case had influenced 3 Supreme Court decisions related to discrimination in transportation settings, establishing stronger protections for passengers and clearer accountability standards for carriers. Legal scholars predicted that these precedents would continue influencing discrimination law for decades to come. International law enforcement agencies had adopted elements of the Coleman Protocol for their own trafficking investigations with remarkable success. Europol had credited the case's methodology with helping them dismantle a similar network operating through European rail systems, rescuing over 150 victims who had been transported across multiple borders using corrupted transportation personnel. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had used comparable techniques to expose corruption in their maritime transportation screening processes, leading to the arrest of 12 officials who had been facilitating drug smuggling operations. The technology sector had also responded innovatively to the case's revelations about how legitimate business systems could be exploited for criminal purposes. Major airlines had invested heavily in new passenger screening software that used artificial intelligence to identify suspicious travel patterns that human screeners might miss. These systems analyzed everything from booking patterns to behavioral indicators, creating risk profiles that helped identify potential trafficking operations before they could be completed. The technology had already proven remarkably effective, identifying dozens of potential trafficking operations in their early stages and preventing countless victimizations. Microsoft, Google, and IBM had all developed specialized versions of this technology, which was now being adapted for use by hotels, rental car companies, and other businesses that might inadvertently facilitate trafficking operations. The case had inspired a new generation of law enforcement professionals who were drawn to careers in anti-trafficking work specifically because of the example Zara had set. FBI recruitment had increased by 30% among women of color following extensive media coverage of her story, while police academies reported increased interest in trafficking awareness training among cadets from diverse backgrounds. Federal agencies now competed actively to attract candidates with varied perspectives and experiences, recognizing that effective law enforcement required teams that reflected the communities they served. The FBI Academy had created a special fellowship program named in Zara's honor, providing additional training opportunities for agents who demonstrated exceptional commitment to civil rights enforcement. Fellows in the Coleman program received specialized training in recognizing how discrimination and organized crime intersected, preparing them to identify criminal enterprises that might otherwise escape detection. Dr. Angela Coleman, Zara's mother, had lived to see her daughter's initial recognition but had passed away 6 months before the United Nations testimony. At her funeral, attended by hundreds of colleagues, victims' families, and community members, Zara had spoken about how her mother's lessons about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice had provided the emotional and intellectual foundation for everything that followed. Mama always told me that how we respond to injustice defines who we are, not just as individuals, but as a society, Zara had said at the service, her voice carrying across the packed church. She taught me that sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't loud confrontation or dramatic gestures, but the quiet, consistent refusal to be diminished by other people's limitations and prejudices. Every time we insist on our own dignity, we create space for others to claim theirs. The Morrison case had also influenced federal sentencing guidelines for trafficking crimes, with judges now required to consider institutional enablement as an aggravating factor in determining punishment. The precedent had led to significantly harsher sentences for criminals who exploited positions of trust or authority to facilitate their crimes, creating powerful deterrent effects for potential offenders in similar positions. Educational institutions had integrated the case into curricula ranging from business ethics to criminal justice to social psychology. Harvard Business School used it as a primary case study in crisis management and corporate responsibility, while the FBI Academy had made it required reading for all new agent classes. Even high schools included elements of the story and social studies courses about civil rights and institutional change, inspiring young people to recognize their own potential to create positive change. The Victim Compensation Fund established by Pacific Northwest Airlines had become a model for corporate accountability in human rights cases, with legal experts calling it the most comprehensive private sector response to institutional complicity in criminal activity. Other companies facing similar scandals had adopted comparable approaches, creating a new standard for corporate responsibility when institutional failures contributed to criminal activity. Zara's speaking engagements had taken her to conferences on 6 continents, sharing insights about how discrimination and organized crime often intersected in ways that traditional law enforcement approaches might miss. Her TED Talk, What Prejudice Reveals About Power, had been viewed over 10 million times and translated into 47 languages, reaching audiences far beyond the law enforcement and legal communities. The talk had resonated particularly strongly with young women facing discrimination in various professional contexts, inspiring them to document their experiences and seek institutional change rather than simply enduring unfair treatment. Universities reported increased enrollment in criminal justice and civil rights law programs following the talk's viral spread. The case had even influenced popular culture, inspiring documentaries, podcasts, and fictional adaptations that brought the story to audiences who might never have encountered it through news coverage alone. Netflix had produced a limited series that dramatized the events while remaining faithful to the documented facts, helping maintain public awareness of trafficking issues while celebrating the power of individual courage to create systematic change. These cultural products had educational value beyond entertainment, with many including resource information for trafficking victims and guidance for bystanders who suspected they might be witnessing exploitation. The series had been particularly effective in reaching international audiences, contributing to global awareness of how trafficking networks operated across borders. As Zara concluded her remarks to the new FBI agents, she returned to the fundamental lesson that had guided her throughout the investigation and its aftermath, a lesson that had applicability far beyond law enforcement contexts. Remember that every interaction you have with the public is an opportunity to either reinforce or challenge systems of injustice, she told them, her voice carrying the authority of experience and the warmth of genuine conviction. Sometimes the most important cases begin not with complex investigations or sophisticated intelligence gathering, but with simple decisions to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent status or circumstances. She paused, looking out at the diverse faces before her, seeing in them the future of law enforcement and the hope for continued progress. The criminals we pursue count on our indifference to their victims' humanity. They depend on systems that treat some people as less worthy of protection than others. When we refuse to provide that indifference, when we insist on seeing every person as fully human and deserving of respect, we take away their greatest weapon and their most reliable protection. The transformation that began with one woman's refusal to be diminished by prejudice had created ripple effects that would protect countless future victims while inspiring a new generation of advocates, investigators, and ordinary citizens to recognize their power to demand justice. In refusing to board that plane without her dignity intact, Zara Coleman had ultimately ensured that many others would never face the choice between safety and self-respect that too many had been forced to make before her. The story that began at Gate 47 had become more than a case study in law enforcement or an example of individual courage. It had become a blueprint for how institutional change could emerge from personal integrity, how individual acts of resistance could expose systematic failures, and how the simple refusal to accept discrimination could ultimately protect the most vulnerable members of society from exploitation and harm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.